Radio Alliance presents The Stoa of the Mind, an exciting radio drama presented by The Sunday Stoic. Welcome to the Charlotte's Grove annual backgammon tournament. First we have the non-Stoics playing. Richardson is in the lead, and they're bearing off now. Oh! He's rolled a 2. That's going to cost him. We now join the Stoic backgammon tournament in progress. They're bearing off now. Oh, he's only rolled a 2. There's no way he'll win now. And he's been told his house is on fire and his wife has left him. All right. Okay. Thanks.
Wisdom,
Prudentia,
justice,
Justitia,
temperance,
Temperantia,
courage.
Fortitudo.
Applying ancient philosophy to modern life. This is the Sunday Stoic.
A reading from Epictetus's Discourses, Book 2, Chapter 5. How is greatness of mind compatible with careful behavior? How then shall one preserve constancy and tranquility of mind, and at the same time the due care that saves us from hasty and thoughtless action? By imitating those who play at dice. The counters are indifferent, the dice are indifferent. How do I know what is going to fall? To use whatever does fall with proper care and skill, that is my business. A reading from Seneca's Letters from a Stoic, from his letter titled On Some Vain Syllogisms. If a man has self-control and wisdom, he is indeed at peace as regards the attitude and habit of his mind, but not as regards the outcome. For as far as his habit of mind is concerned, he is not perturbed or saddened or afraid, but there are many extraneous causes which strike him and bring perturbation upon him. No fortune, no external circumstance can shut off the wise man from action, for the very thing which engages his attention prevents him from attending to other things. He is ready for either outcome. If it brings goods, he controls them. If evils, he conquers them. So thoroughly, has he schooled himself that he makes manifest his virtue in prosperity as well as in adversity, and keeps his eyes on virtue itself, not on the objects with which virtue deals. A reading from Seneca's Letters on Liberal and Vocational Studies. I, for my part, do not know what is to be, but I do know what may come to be. I shall have no misgivings in this matter. I await the future in its entirety, and if there is any abatement in its severity, I make the most of it. If the morrow treats me kindly, it is sort of a deception, but it does not deceive me even at that. For just as I know all things can happen, they will not happen in every case. I am ready for favorable events in every case, but I am prepared for evil.
Joining us on the podcast today is Justin Vacula, who is studying clinical mental health counseling and hosts meetings for the Northeastern Pennsylvania Free Thought Society. He's also the host of the Stoic Solutions Podcast. Thank you for joining the Sunday Stoic today.
And thank you for having me.
Just quickly, Justin, how did you get into this philosophy?
I think I first heard about Stoicism through Massimo Pigliucci, who maintains the How to Be a Stoic blog, in that he talked about Stoicism on his former podcast, Rationally Speaking podcast. I noticed it there, I found it interesting, but I didn't do too much with it at the time until Stoicism came up once again later on a different podcast, the Thinking Poker podcast, in which they brought up the works of Epictetus. They mentioned the Enchiridion, his handbook, as a resource for poker players. And I thought this was really interesting, being a poker player and thinking, oh, wow, well, I'm already interested in philosophy. I studied that in undergraduate school and was learning a lot about poker at the time. So I looked into the works of Epictetus and, oh, wow, well, there's a lot he has to say that can help me be a better person and a better poker player. I then looked into more of the Stoic authors, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and I made a lot of notes in the margins, and a lot of those poker in there and thought, wow, this is a really valuable resource that can help me at the tables that I had overlooked before.
So do you see a lot of parallels between being a good Stoic and being a good poker player?
Absolutely. There are many central themes in Stoicism, one of which is being focused on a process and not the outcomes. They talk so much about how we're to focus on things that are inside of our control rather than focus on things that are not. And with poker, with other games of chance, there is an element of skill. And we can make the best decisions, but ultimately not get some positive results, at least in the short run. And a lot of poker is just dealing with the ups and the downs of the game, where you have a great hand, but your opponent happens to just improve when many of these real, as some would say, freak occurrences would happen. I'd be maybe 95% favorite to win a hand at one point, and then that one card comes out and I happen to lose the biggest pot of the night, right? So a lot of poker comes on dealing with that. And I see at the tables a lot of people who have a very poor mental game, that they react very strongly and negatively to losing in certain cases and all sorts of things that even happen outside of the game. And this leads them to lose a lot of money. They get very angry. They have this attitude of entitlement, and they go from playing a really solid game to a very, very terrible game.
So you actually see their attitude affect how good of a poker player they are as the night moves on.
Absolutely. You'll see certain events happen on the table. It's a common thing. Players talk about people going on tilt, where they happen to just make these really poor decisions. You know, they're going all in without even looking at their cards. They're just outright saying, I don't even care. I'm just trying to get my money back at this point, and just taking risks that are just far too great. Given the current circumstances. And we see that in poker, a solid state of mind will help us gain money and to be a better player. Whereas if we're not paying attention to how we're feeling, we're letting our negative emotions get the best of it, then we're going to have some really bad outcomes, that's for sure. So there's definitely a practical benefit of Stoic philosophy at the tables.
Has this philosophy helped you outside of the casino as well?
Yes, I currently work as a student, as you mentioned, of clinical mental health counseling. I work with students in elementary school setting. I work as an intern counselor in training, and I get to meet with students throughout the day, and they talk about some common occurrences, that someone's being mean to them, that they're upset with a teacher, that they're having just difficult time. And it's not the academic stuff, but more of the mental health and behavioral side. And we're able to talk about these problems. Well, why is it that you feel what you feel? What are some things we can do about this? Stoicism encourages us to be very proactive and to have this clarity of mind, to be aware of what we're feeling and why. Is this really worth the hassle? Are we creating problems for ourselves? Is there a different way we can view the situation? So I use Stoic philosophy as a counselor in training to benefit others, and even to keep that tranquility and peace of mind within myself.
I think a lot of the Stoic techniques involve that shift in perspective. What would have been a downer instead becomes, I guess, like you could say, the obstacle is the way, if you will. What would have been something that weighed you down or gave you a terrible attitude for the rest of the day now just becomes a challenge, and we move on and adapt and overcome.
Right. And Stoicism takes a pretty radical approach in saying that things don't really cause us to be angry, but rather it's our interpretation of things that lead to anger or that are associated with anger, as we see that many people can have a different reaction to something. Road rage is a common example, right? We'll see one person just get really upset and start honking their horn, and they can't even deal with it, right? But I see something like, I'll shrug my shoulders, I'll laugh about it, and just not let others bring me down, that I can be mindful and say, well, this really isn't worth it. I might feel a little bit annoyed, but I'm not going to let that get the best of me. And if I do find myself feeling that tinge of anger or being bothered or annoyed, well, how can I work to be more productive and not to be in this constant state of being on edge and being upset? It's just not the type of life I like to live. So that tranquility, that inner calm, is definitely something that we can have
applying Stoic philosophy.
Now, let's do a hypothetical situation here. I have a relative who shall remain unnamed, who was watching his favorite football team, the Ohio State Buckeyes, and they lost a game that I don't know if there was money on this or not, but he was very emotionally tied up in the game. They lost, and before the end of the evening, there was a hole in his drywall, and his remote control was in the wall. How would you suggest? Let's say you could intervene in the head of this individual, and give them, be like Jiminy Cricket, and give them advice. You could be I don't know what would be a Stoic. Epictetus Cricket. No, I don't know. I was trying to think of a Stoic version of Jiminy Cricket, but you could be on their shoulder and give them some advice on how to adjust their mental attitude before it escalated to the point of losing their remote in the wall.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, because we can sometimes respond to that, right? I mean, would we be on that couch as he's watching the game, or that seat, and be able to talk him through it? Or are we just responding to the event after? So if we're responding to the event, we could talk to him and say, well, what has happened here? What's gone on? And have him explain. It might be hard in that moment for him to explain, as it would take him a few minutes to de-escalate. Let's imagine, change the example. I'll take a liberty of doing that and say it's like a 6th grader, a 5th grader, right? We'll give him a chance to calm down, make sure that he's safe, that he's not a danger to himself or others. And after maybe a period of de-escalation, he's more calm, he wants to talk about it. And we'll say, well, what do you think led to that, punching the wall or throwing that remote? And maybe they'll say, well, I was really angry about it. Okay, I can understand that. So can you tell me, what does that mean to be angry? So we'll have the conversation about that. And we'll say, well, why is it that do you know why you threw that remote or punched that hole in the wall? And we'll talk about those feelings and say, well, what can be a more productive way to cope with those feelings? And we could even go deeper in trying to get at the motive of that, or the thoughts concerning the football game, and provide some feedback and saying, well, there was really indeed nothing you can do about it, and that these kind of things happen, and understand now, if there was money on the game, then we can focus on, well, was this a good bet to make? And even if it happened to be that we had some sort of advantage, it was a good line, our money was in good, as can happen in the case in gambling, we'll say, well, we're just going to accept that, and that we can't always win, right? We're not always going to have things go according to the way we want. Again, a central theme within Stoicism, as events of chance, death, misfortune, all these things can happen. We're not immune to it. Life is the struggle, as the Stoics put it, that it's not a dance, it's a campaign, it's a voyage, it's a journey, and a lot of these things are going to happen around us. So the question is, how are we going to cope with that? Clearly, throwing the remote at the wall isn't going to be a good way to do it. They'll say, oh, well, maybe I felt a little bit better, but what are the consequences of that? Did we feel good? Was that our preferred thing to do? Is anger going to be the weapon that we want to take to battle? Or can we cope with it in a more productive way? It's not about saying don't have emotions. It's about, well, let's realize that, okay, this can lead to me, this is associated with me being angry. So how can I have a different perspective about things so that I'm not angry, so I'm not destroying property, so that I'm not doing things that I would later regret?
So, I have a almost 2-year-old boy now, and do you have any advice from your line of work in terms of when we see behavior that we want to correct as he gets older? The way I was raised, it involved usually a spanking, which we're trying to avoid.
Right. We don't want children and youth coming over.
But do you have any advice on talking with children about the issues they're having on a day-to-day basis?
I think it's really important that conversation, communication is pretty open, and to let them know, yes, you're there for them to chat about struggles that they might have, encourage this spirit of openness. I think it's the case that some children really don't get that conversation. They don't get that attention. Perhaps their parents are uninvolved. They've had some circumstances where they've been from family to family, even kids in the foster home system, that they don't really have that stable, trusted caregiver. So to try to build that bond, to try to create that environment that encourages openness and discussion is really important. It might take a while to build that rapport, and building that rapport, that ability to have those conversations, the person feels comfortable and safe being around you, that can come about with just listening to them, hearing them out, what they have to say, and having some empathy and trying to reflect their feeling and thoughts. These are basic counseling skills that I've learned throughout my studies, and I hope I've been able to apply. And even some little things like just giving your kids some time, even playing games with them. Is that something that I do with my work? We have what's called positive breaks, where we provide some positive reinforcement to the kids when they have a good day. And we're going to note that, yes, this is really good progress that you've made, and give them rewards even for some of their behaviors. It's a good thing, whether it's an outing, whether it's a special meal. These are things that, from my experience, have a really good benefit.
Excellent. I'm hoping to raise a son that can tolerate misfortunes better than the unnamed uncle. So that's my goal.
Right. And yes, just the acceptance of that, right? It's a common theme within Stoicism that we're just be aware that this misfortune, in a way, and that might not even be the right word to use, as Stoics would go away from that and saying this is bound to happen, this is something inevitable, bear it nobly. Don't see it as bad fortune, but perhaps the good fortune could be in having a good reaction to it and making the most of our circumstances, and to not say, oh, well, I want things to go a certain way and I'm going to be upset when they don't. Well, of course, we would want things to go according to our plan or what we might expect, or if we feel entitled towards something. But these aren't things that are going to help. We can work and focus on the process, work toward a good outcome, but recognize that no matter what we do, we can't avoid pain. We can't avoid suffering. It's just not going to happen. So how can we do our best to prepare for it, to cope with it, and to respond well?
So when you lose $300 at the table, do you have that flash of what Proto Passion, as Seneca might call it, where you're like, oh, and then does that follow up with bear it nobly, bear it nobly, bear it nobly, or how do you deal with that internally while keeping your poker face?
It's quite an interesting thing about poker, in that the luck element or the chance element of the game is actually what keeps the game going. It were the case that poker was completely a skill game, that it was something like chess, as chess is almost 100% skill. There might be some things in chess like, oh, your opponent got 6, so you happen to have an advantage in the game, and some chance elements, right? But with poker, there is that element of chance, and that keeps the game going, because if it was completely or mostly this game of skill, it's hard to assign those exact percentages, right? But having the recreational players, the players who really aren't that studied, having them winning sometimes keeps the game going, because if they didn't win at all, they would be discouraged and probably quit. But since they can win sometimes, there's that gamble element to it, right? That they keep coming back. So we're to appreciate this in a way. For what kind of universe would you want? The Stoics say you could just kind of have it that way, that if you were to have that, oh, it's only a skill-based game and that the opponent is never going to win, then your game is quickly going to go away. It's not going to exist, right? If you were playing this chess for money, that the weaker opponent would just continue losing and they just wouldn't come back to the tables. But here we can see a bad beat, as we talk about, right? That this was this unfortunate occurrence. We could see that as a receipt in a way for good play, that we made this good decision and be focused on that, to be focused on the right things. Did I play this hand well? What was the likelihood that my opponent had this certain holding, right? We could analyze the hand and talk about it after the fact, but being angry about it at the time is not going to help. just bemoaning the universe and, oh, this is terrible, this and that. That's not going to help our situation. We might want to tell the story to some friends or think about, oh, well, this is an unfortunate thing. We could talk about these losses. In poker, we call them bad beat stories, but it's not really going to help. We have to have this attitude of, well, if I'm making the right plays, if I'm making the right decisions, then in the long run, it's going to work out in my advantage. And perhaps facing some losses ourselves can be a humbling experience, and it can encourage us to further analyze our play and study. We can always continue to be better, not only as poker players, but just in life, that we have this attitude of humility. This is a common theme within Stoicism, to question our desires, to question what we think is valuable, and to have these conversations openly with friends and look into what people from the past and even contemporaries have to say.
So do you have a Stoic routine that you do in terms of preparing for life rather than the poker game? Like, do you keep a journal, or do you do readings every day, or what do you do to reflect on this philosophy in your daily life?
A recent podcast episode I had was called 5 Stoic Mantras You Can Use, and that a listener asked, what are some phrases that you can say to yourself to help you throughout the day? I had some of my ideas and put them into this episode. One comes from Seneca. He has this phrase, all is well with a commander. He talks about a man on a ship who's been besieged by an enemy, and he decides that, well, there's really nothing I can do about this situation. I don't want to give up my battle plan. I don't want to be tortured by the enemy, and I'm just going to commit suicide. It's quite a radical thing to do, and Stoics see it as a brave act to end one's life when it is fitting and to not live a wretched existence. It's again, not going to be a decision that's going to be made so quickly, so willy-nilly. It's, in this case, a very measured one. Right. And I could say all is well with a commander in my life when dealing with some adversity and saying, well, I still have my faculty of choice intact. I still have these other good things going for me. Just because one part of life is going poorly, I'm not going to have this position that life is totally bleak. Right. This is something common for people with clinical depression, that they'll focus overly on the negatives and not look at the positives, right? Gratitude, this is a common theme within the Stoic texts, to appreciate the positives that we have, to not take things for granted, and to really take a full picture view of things. So all is well with the commander. He says, even though some things might be going wrong, that we still have some good things going for us, even in this radical case of being besieged by an enemy. I mean, how much worse can you really get there besides being, tortured there? He said that. It's kind of a joke, a laughing matter in a way. And I think about that through the day. As another one is, he says, well, what if the worst does happen? And he says, let's see who wins. Let's just take it and go with it. It's a funny thing, and humor helps me too throughout the day, right? There's a lot of humor, the Stoic texts. And I mentioned I took this survey. It's via Institute Character Strengths. It's viasurvey.org, and it notes these positive characteristics about yourself. You take a survey, and for me, humor was one of the top coping mechanisms, and just laughing at the absurdity of life, just recognizing, well, this was bound to happen. Just lost, $2,000 in this pot, but you know what? I played it well, and sometimes I have to pay out like a slot machine, and it keeps the game going, and just kind of laughing about the experience too. Try to remain happy, to have that constancy of mind amidst all the ups and downs of life. It's really important.
That reminds me also of the all is well with the commander. It reminds me a bit of Stillbow or Stillbow, or how there's two different spellings I've found that Seneca writes about, where I think he's a philosopher. He wasn't a Stoic, but they admired him. They sacked his city and burned his house down. By the way, listeners, you probably hear my little boy playing in the background, but for only like $10,000 on Patreon, I'll build a studio.
Preferred and different, of course.
But preferred and different, absolutely. So they sack his city, and Stillbow is walking away from the burning wreckage of what was his home, and there's the commander of the advancing army, and I don't remember the exact line, but the guy's like, "So how you doing, Stillbow?" And he just says, I have lost nothing. So that kind of ticks off the commander, who's hoping he'd be like, oh, I've lost everything I own. But Stillbow's like, I carry all my goods with me. His goods being, as you said earlier, the ability, the freedom of choice, as Epictetus talks about. Whenever an obstacle pops up in front of you, it's stopping your original plan, but we know that we always want to go into things saying fate permitting, and what's our new avenue, what's our new choice? We have a new dichotomy, a new set of choices to make, and we make those choices as we go. So Stillbow lost everything, and yet when the everything physical anyway, right? Like his family probably and his possessions, but when the commander of the army says, how's it going? Did you have a good day today? And he's like, I've lost nothing.
That's a good one.
All is well.
Yeah. There's that level of indifference that's there, and that we recognize that there are all these external things the Stoics mention that we really don't have this control over. Everything you touch turns to dust, right? This kind of deal. Some inspiration I get from some music I listen to, I find parallels with Stoic themes. A song by the band Death called Suicide Machine, talking about the theme of death with dignity, right? Ending one's life in old age, especially when having some sort of chronic illness, deciding that life is no longer worth living. It's a simple lyric. It says, a request to die with dignity. Is that too much to ask? And here in modern society, unfortunately, there are many barriers to that, where people simply can't have control over their lives in that way. And the Stoics advise us to leave the burning building, as they say. If there's so much smoke, simply get out. And not only the case with suicide, when there's good reason to do so, especially in old age, as I said, I always give that qualification there, right? But in other cases, there might be some things that we just want to walk away from if it's just not worth our effort. And Stoicism really seems to lead us to question what we value, what's important to us, right? And in gambling, surely if I see a poker game, I probably won't be winning too much here, or there's not enough money in the table, I'm not going to play that game. Like, why should I put myself in a situation where it doesn't seem to be to my advantage or having some social good or some benefit? And surely throughout the casino, there are a lot of slot machines I walk by and don't play because I don't have an advantage in those, except for some extreme circumstances of promotions or certain progressive jackpots,
some algorithm.
There's always that. But in many cases, we're going to pass up many things. Well, what might have me feel good? I mean, drugs, maybe that, I'd feel a little bit good if I took some cocaine, people might say, but is that really going to work out for us in the long run, right? That might be an extreme example, but surely we've had a lot of ideas about things we want to avoid. And Stoicism should lead us to question that which we value and reprioritize our life, especially if we find ourselves doing the same thing over and over again and being unhappy. We're just in an environment that's not really conducive to our happiness, right? We have certain friends that happen to be a drag on our lives where the effort doesn't seem to be worth it anymore. It can be best to simply walk away from situations and really question whether it's worth our time, our money, our energy, right?
Absolutely. It's that living that examined life, which if you just turn on the TV at the end of the day and stare at it until bedtime, it's hard to do.
It might be easy to zone out in a way or to prioritize pleasure over everything else, but is that really the way that we want to live? Is that really going to give us meaning in life? Instead, we can have a sort of balance, right? We can have some leisure, we can have some fun, but also do something that's meaningful for us. I hear these people, they complain about their jobs, they complain about their relationships, and well, what are you doing to change that? They're in this, what they might call a soul-sucking 9-to-5 job. They're married. They're not in a position they like. They really want to get a divorce, but they think it would be too expensive. And they're just in this situation in life that's really negative. Well, is that the kind of life we want to live? Can we make some changes to improve our quality of life? That's really important.
Absolutely. And then having the fortitude to make it happen.
Yeah, to pull the trigger, courage. That's one of our Stoic virtues, right? In the beginning of your podcast, sure. Courage.
Fortitudo. Courage. That's right. Although I've had intros from several folks sent in, I never know which one to put on. Like I have like 3 or 4 excellent intros.
Oh, you should roll the dice. That's imitate those who play at dice, right?
That's right. Let's see what's going to come up today. That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
It's a nice thing. This finding meaning. I think it's something that Stoicism can really offer. In that many people are really questioning and saying, well, look, there are all these things in life that I don't particularly like. Modern society seems to be a drag, but what can I do to live a more fulfilled life? I find that really important and can take away from Stoicism that we can apply this ancient wisdom into everyday life to improve ourselves, to have a foundation from which to act. And maybe listeners might be averse to some of the Stoic ideas and they'll pick and take some, and that's all right. Pick what works for you, go with it, and benefit from it. As Seneca talks about, even drawing knowledge from Epicurus, who happened to be of a rival philosophical school. He talks of truth being common property, and to use information for good, for benefiting ourselves, regardless of where it comes from.
Being an eclectic philosopher is fine, as long as that philosopher part's the most important part. I think is the once again analyzing why it is you're doing what you're doing, and having a compass to help guide to guide your ship as you're sailing through the seas of life, I'd say.
Right, and have the courage to want to improve, the motivation to sustain that. There are a lot of reasons to be a better person, right? I mean, you get all these New Year's resolutions coming about every year. Oh, I'm going to quit smoking, I'm going to lose weight. And a lot of this doesn't happen, right? They'll just say they want to do it, but do they have a good plan? And doing so, can they stick with it, right? I think Stoicism can help us. Stoicism can help us a lot in having this foundation, this bedrock from which to work from.
Justin, where can listeners go to find more of your content?
You can go to stoicsolutionspodcast.com, where you can find links to my social media portals, recent podcast episodes, past content, and much more. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. There are many portals you can contact me from.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast today.
Yep. All right. And thanks for having me on. If people want to reach out also through email, you can email me justinvacula@gmail.com, justinvacula@gmail.com.
Thank you for listening to the Sunday Stoic Podcast. You can contact the show at sundaystoic@gmail.com. You can leave a voicemail for the show at 501-503-3132. And keep in touch by following us on Facebook and Twitter. You can support the show by donating on Patreon, www.patreon.com/SundayStoic. You can also help us out by rating us on iTunes or whichever podcast provider you use. Thank you for your support. Carpe diem.